A couple weeks ago, I shared a devotional out of Luke 14 on the cost of discipleship. And that passage and the cross-reference that I mentioned, Mark 10, talking about the rich young ruler, both of those things are very heavily focused on that initial decision to follow Jesus, that initial decision for discipleship. And after I shared it, the Lord started stirring something, additional in my heart on this topic that I want to share with you here. And it's more geared towards those who have been following Jesus for years. Because I think what happens a lot, not in everybody, I hate blanket statements, but what can happen in the Christian community is that we make that initial decision. We lay down what's objectively bad for what's objectively good. And then we kind of treat that decision as a means to an end, meaning that now within the context of my Christianity, I can live however I want to. And on one hand, you can, right? I mean, Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 10, all things are permissible, but not all things are beneficial. So yeah, you can do whatever you want. You have free will. And if the things that you're doing are objectively good, then I guess you can kind of shrug it off. But it might not be edifying to you, and it might not be what God's called you to do, right? So the truth is that initial decision for discipleship really just made way to like a million more decisions that we make to follow Jesus within our walk with him. And so the question, just to put it out there from the beginning, is how closely do you want to follow Jesus? That's the heart of this devotional. How closely do you want to follow Jesus? Because your walk will consist of having to make decisions between two objectively good things more often than not. We can make the easy decisions, right? Clearly, when we're choosing between what's objectively good and objectively bad, we choose the objectively good thing. Problem solved. But what do you do when you're choosing between two objectively good things? Here's what I mean by that. Maybe you have a couple kids and you're married and you're also plugged into ministry. And you're not neglecting one for the other, right? You've got it pretty well balanced. But what if God says, you know what, for a season, I want you to lay the ministry down and solely focus on discipling your children, being present at home, nurturing your marriage? Would you do it? If that was the cost of discipleship for this season in your walk, would you do it? What if it's the other way around? What if you've been faithfully discipling your children and nurturing your marriage and present at home, and God says, you know what, you have this thing to offer, and I really want you plugged into the local church to pour into other people that need what you have for a season? Would you do it? If the cost of discipleship was learning how to balance both of those things, would you do it? I think that more often than not, I remember a few years ago being in a position where I had to choose between two, actually I think it was three things that all were good things and they all made sense on paper. It was a nightmare. I'm a decisive person. I don't have a problem making a decision, but I'm looking at these three things like, Lord, they're all good. What am I supposed to say no to? And what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to balance all three? Do I choose two? Do I choose one? What do you want from me? Look, if you know me, you know that I have wanted to move to South Carolina for a few years now. That's not a secret. I talk about it all the time. I am firmly planted here because it's obvious that this is where God has us called for this season. But, in my heart of hearts, man, I really want to get there. And there's nothing objectively wrong with that, right? It's not a bad thing to move out of state. But the problem is that it's bad for me. It would not be good for me because God has called me here. And that is one of the biggest lessons that I've learned in my walk with the Lord, is that it's not really objective anymore. If I'm walking with him, it's personal. It's about what's good for me. Making the decisions with him, guided by the Holy Spirit, guided by his word, that is good for me according to what he's called me to do in this season. That's the truth of discipleship. And I think that a really beautiful illustration of this biblically is in the book of Acts, looking at Paul as he sails to Rome. In Acts 19, God promises Paul that he will stand before Caesar in Rome. Paul is arrested for preaching the gospel. We know that, he's guilty of nothing, right? He's just preaching the gospel, but he's arrested. He's held in prison. You've got Festus that has him in prison. Really doesn't know what to do with him. I get the feeling that he's a little annoyed by him. Felix too. But he knows that he's done nothing wrong, but he doesn't want to set him free because the people will riot over this. So Paul ends up sitting in jail for years. Then Festus is succeeded by Felix, who then has a very similar disposition that Festus had. So Paul ends up going and standing before King Agrippa, shares his story with King Agrippa, and the King Agrippa is pretty swayed by it. He says, Paul, you've nearly converted me in such a short time, just hearing your story. And King Agrippa plainly states, like, you're not guilty of anything, but Paul appeals to Caesar. He appeals to Caesar, which means he's foregoing his ability to go free in this moment, and he wants to go stand before Caesar instead. And so King Agrippa honors that, and Paul is moved to a ship with the other prisoners to sail to Rome to stand before Caesar. And after he leaves, he looks at Felix and he says, that man would have been free if he didn't appeal to Caesar. Paul was on paper, he was entitled to freedom. Objectively speaking, it would have been good for Paul to accept that freedom because he was guilty of nothing. But it would not have been good for him because God called him to Rome. That's the cost of discipleship for the believer. That is what we're laying down. We're laying down the things that we are entitled to in some ways. Look, we know that we're really entitled to nothing, but in a worldly sense where Paul was sitting, he was entitled to freedom because he bore no guilt. So we lay down what we're entitled to. We lay down our logic. We lay down trying to reason things out. And we choose the thing that is good for us. And the thing that is good for us is not what makes the most sense to us on paper. It's not what benefits us most. It's not what everybody around us would best understand. It's what God is calling us to do. That is the good thing for you and I. That is the best thing for you and I, is to do the thing that God is calling us to do. That is where the fruit is. That is where we will experience the peace and the joy that comes from walking with the Lord to the fullest extent. That is where we want to be. And that does cost us something. It requires something of us. Every day being a disciple, every day following Jesus will require something of us. We get to decide how closely we follow Jesus. And I don't know about you, but I want to be as close as I can get.